Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigers.
Welcome back everyone to the Fly Culture Podcast. Today's guest has caught trout in the streams of Australia, steelhead in British Colombia, built and sold custom rods, and has written for The Drake, Fly Life, and appears for the second time in the latest edition of Fly Culture. I'm pleased to welcome Ben Mackereth to this episode. Ben, it's wonderful to have you along. How are you doing today?
I'm wonderful, Pete, and thank you so much for having me on. It's a real privilege.
It's great to have you along, and listeners will no doubt pick up that you're not from the UK. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're from?
Yes, I'm Australian and currently living in Australia. I grew up in South Australia, so one of the states towards the bottom of the continent, and lived there for 30 years, moved to Canada, the west coast of Canada, Vancouver area for 5 years, and now we're back on the east coast of Australia, sort of at the bottom of the Great Barrier Reef area, so subtropical. Been living back here for 10 years now since moving back from Canada.
So we've got plenty to talk about and the comparisons of the fishing. What I'm thinking about a little bit as well is that I'm sitting looking out the window. It's raining, it's wet, it's miserable. Our season's coming to a close. I guess you're feeling the exact opposite, aren't you? Your season's just getting underway.
Yeah, it is to a degree. Up here in the subtropics, you can sort of fish year round for the species up here, freshwater, saltwater. But our trout waters are just opening up in the southern part of the continent. So, I'm planning to get down there at some point and have a crack at that. Our weather's starting to get warmer as yours is getting cooler, obviously. So, yeah.
And what are your favourite species then? Because I know we were talking off mic and you said that you need to travel a little way for the trout fishing. Does that mean you have other forms of fishing nearby?
Yeah, we do. I probably don't capitalise on the fishing much around here, as much as I should, I suppose. I love my cold water species. I don't know why. I grew up in a completely dry state with very little freshwater resources, but I just fell in love with trout. And all of our trout, we don't have native trout down here or native salmonids, so they're all introduced. But we do have the odd brook trout, but mainly brown trout and rainbow trout. And there's a couple of lakes that have Chinook salmon, which are put in by hatcheries, and a couple that have Atlantic salmon, landlocked. And I haven't caught all of those species here. It's mainly the trout. But I sort of tend to focus on those when I can. However, up here we have a native fish called the Australian bass, which I think was in that first article for Fly Life I had. And they're great. They're a bit like the North American bass. They sort of very similar looking, similar habits. They'll grab a surface popper. We've got a fish called a barramundi, which Pete Morse might have spoken about, but they're a really great sport fish up here. And then we've got a bunch of saltwater species. So it's sort of where I live is it's sort of a merge between the temperate waters from the south and the tropical waters of the north. So you get a real mix of species. So there's plenty to target around here. And I live very close to the beach, so I could literally walk down with my fly rod and have a go at catching something at least. But there's plenty to do year round here.
Lovely. And it sounds as though trout, would it be fair to say trout are your first love despite them not being on your doorstep?
They are, yeah, they are. I like growing up in South Australia, we had a few little creeks that held a few stocked trout, and how they survived, I don't know. We have really hot summers down there. The water gets quite warm, but they're tough and they survive down there. And I started catching those, but as soon as I got my driver's license, I would just head to the Australian high country, which was about a 10-hour drive from where I did live and about a 12-hour drive from where I live now. And I get to those cold water streams, and I'm in my element there. I just absolutely love that environment, the mountains, the freestone streams. So that's my first love, absolutely.
And as the season gets underway, it seems to me that you have to plan your trips then, because a 10-hour journey, for me, is really Devon to Scotland. And so there's no way that I'm going to do that in a day. I've done some pretty long ones in the past, but not as long as that. Does that mean those trips will be extended into long weekends or week-long trips? How do you tend to do that?
Yeah. I don't get down there as often as I like because of the distance, but we'll either, if I drive, you'd have to put, a day and a half down for driving, and they're long trips, obviously. So I generally fly down. We've got a little local airport here, and I can fly down to the city of Melbourne. And then we can, I get picked up by a mate there, or we can rent a car, and you only have to drive 2 hours out of that city and you get into some really nice trout country. So flying's the way to go if you're strapped for time, and that's what I generally do when I can. So
that makes perfect sense. And then what do you do for those trips? Do you camp, or will you sort of stay in B&Bs? How do those trips sort of play out for you?
Generally we'll camp. We like to do things cheaply. And also, when you're out in the sticks and you want to get up into the high little tributaries, you sort of have to camp by necessity. But on our last trip down south, we'll camp for one night in a motel near some major rivers, and then we'll head into the hills from there and just sleep under the stars if the weather permits. And it's the right way to do it. Just get that whole wilderness experience. It just makes the trip. So we camp out whenever we can. Yeah.
That sounds really cool. Does that mean then that you have to travel to get away? Are there a lot of people heading to these rivers? I'm just trying to get a feeling of, and we're going to come on to it shortly, but are the rivers densely populated, the places that you're going to?
Surprisingly not. Down in the states of Victoria, New South Wales, and of course Tasmania, fly fishing is quite popular, but we rarely see anybody else on the rivers. And if there are, there's always plenty of room. They're never crowded, which is a stark contrast to a lot of rivers in British Columbia, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But there's always somewhere. We've always found somewhere where we can fish in solitude, and it's not difficult to find. Even the little roadside spots where there's little pullouts and parking bays, there might be one or two people there, but there's always room to fish and always fish for everybody. So we're really, really fortunate in that we don't have that crowding that I've seen anyway. So I'm sure there's areas that do get crowded, but we haven't really come across them. But we like to go as remote as we can as well. So.
Can you, for myself and for listeners, can you help set the tone of what these streams are like size-wise and early season? How you like to fish them and what's actually going on the streams? Is there much by way of hatches happening, and or are you prospecting the water? Are you looking for rising fish? How are you sort of looking and approaching them early on in the season?
Yeah, so we've got... with the trout rivers, we've got probably, I can think of 3 or 4 tailwaters off the top of my head that are quite popular. And they're, early in the season, they're quite good because, you're sort of coming out of winter, they've got a regular flow, and it's not until summer kicks in that those particular rivers get quite high because they're releasing a lot of water for irrigation. But those rivers stay quite cool. And they are predominantly hatch driven, so they can be a bit tricky and a bit technical, which is my way of saying I'm not very good at catching trout on those rivers. But a lot of the rivers that we target are free flowing and come out of the hills, and they're mainly freestone. I'd say small rivers, probably 10, 20 feet across, sometimes smaller, sometimes a little bit bigger. But just those beautiful tumbling mountain streams, and early in the season, as long as because it's the winter rains and you'll get snow melt, so they can be quite high, those free flowing rivers early in the season. But towards the start of summer, they sort of come down and they produce really, really good fishing. But the trick in Australia, as it is in many parts of the world, is to find a river where the temperatures aren't too high. You can have these really hot days down there, and it can stress the trout out pretty quickly. We were lucky this last time we went down that we've had some weather systems that have reduced the temperature of the streams at that time of year. So we've had some spectacular trout fishing over the last 1 or 2 seasons. That might change this year. But those little streams are wonderful because they make a pretty ordinary trout fisher look great. They are very opportunistic trout. They take terrestrial. So you can happily go out with a royal wolf, a red tag, maybe an Adams, and catch all the fish. Well, not all the fish you want, but you can have some great fishing with those 3 flies. In fact, last time I was down there, I got out onto the river and I used a dry dropper. I hung a little nymph down about 6-8 inches underneath. But the fish were ignoring that, swimming past it and grabbing the dry. So I just cut the nymph off. And of course, everyone loves dry fly fishing if it's there. So we're really lucky in that respect. If you can hit it right, the fishing's quite good. So very enjoyable. Yeah.
And what are you fishing with? Is it sort of 9 foot 3-4 weights? How do you like to fish?
I've got a 9 foot 5 weight because everybody does have, and that's just a great all round general rod. So I'll start with that on some of the bigger rivers, but some of the smaller ones we fish are a little bit tighter, a little bit more vegetation over them. And I've got a little 7 foot 6 3 weight graphite rod, which is just a sweetheart of a rod. I love using that. I hate putting it down. I love using that rod. And if it's even tighter than that, or there's smaller, sort of more delicate streams, I've got a 6 foot 6 fiberglass rod, which is also a wonderful little rod. So I as much as I love salmon fishing, Pacific salmon, I've never fished for Atlantic salmon, and steelhead and things like that with a bigger gear, I really, really love the small, tight stream and 3 weights. So I haven't gone anything smaller than a 3 weight, but I'm considering it. I'm considering going a bit smaller, but that's my absolute preferred fishing. Yeah,
like the sound of it. What I'm alluding to and circling round to is getting an idea of the fishing there. And also I'd love to understand the culture there, the fly fishing culture. Is it a biggish community, or because it's such a big country, are the anglers spread out? Is there a fly fishing community within the country, or does it tend to be state located?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's sort of it does vary throughout the country. So the southeastern portion of the country, where the trout waters are, there is a real community of freshwater fly anglers down there. Up these parts, it does change a bit, and there's no less fly fishing. It's mainly saltwater up here. Flats type fishing and golden trevally, there's a bit of GTs, there's permit, that sort of stuff. So I would say if you were to cut Australia in half north to south, the northern half would be primarily saltwater fishing and the southern half primarily freshwater fishing. And obviously there's overlap and they can do either each way. But the fishing, it's a really interesting story. Our brown trout in Australia originally came out, there were several failed attempts, but our brown trout came out from the UK actually originally, and there were many failed attempts, but they came out on moss in an old wooden sailing ship back in I don't know if it was the 17 or the 1800s, and some of these eggs survived, and that's what has developed into the whole population of brown trout throughout Australia, and I think New Zealand as well. So it's a really remarkable story that they lasted that long at that time. And we really love them down here. We just, we've got rainbow trout from the States as well, but there's a real culture around the trout here, as well as our native fish, and we have some beautiful native fish species as well. But as I said, in the southern part of the continent, it's the trout that really sort of dominate the fly fishing scene. Yeah. Does that answer your question, sort of? Or?
Absolutely. And I was going to come on to, and you mentioned Peter Morse, and funnily enough, I was talking to him just yesterday on Facebook that he's over in the UK at the moment. I said, he was up in Scotland, and we've had him on the podcast. And two of my favourite fishing programmes come out of that neck of the woods. And there's obviously Peter's program, which I just thought was way, way ahead of its time, and A River Somewhere as well, which was just magical at showcasing. So I'm sort of, when you're talking about those streams in Australia, my eyes are closed and I'm sort of thinking of the guys there casting their humpies. I think they used to like to fish on the streams there, and they were a wonderful export for fishing and letting us know about what you guys are doing down there. Did you sort of get as much enjoyment out of them as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think, and I mentioned this, I think, in the article that's coming out, but you always hear about a river runs through it in America and how that sort of developed the fly fishing scene in the States at that time. And not long after that came out, we did have A River Somewhere series in Australia. And they, I watched them the other day. I've got them on, I got them on my little iPad, and I just never get sick of it. And the unique thing about that series is that they, Rob Sitch and Tom Gleisner, who are comedians basically, so they're just really funny, sort of earthy guys, but they're not scared to make fun of themselves, and they really they made it an adventure. So they always had a really interesting way of getting to their fishing grounds. There was the fishing themselves, and then there was always a recipe at the end. But they made it a real journey. And a lot of the fishing, and I don't want to criticize anything, but a lot of the fishing shows these days, they sort of start at the action, and that's where it is. And it misses that whole fun part of preparing for the trip. So those programs were super influential on me. And if you can, anybody listening, and you understand this, Pete, but if you look at the episodes of the Halkwa River and the Bundara River, I think that's the sort of rivers that I'm fishing, and that I absolutely love. And they're just beautiful little streams. So super influential, and absolutely love those series, and Peter Morse's series as well.
Yeah. And as Ben says, if you can hunt them out, I have a confession that I did contact Rob to see if I could get him on the podcast, but he was just too busy. It sounds like he's got a hell of a lot on his plate. And I tried really hard because, like you say, I think it's for a TV program was really, it wasn't about the fish pool aspect of it. It was two friends enjoying each other's company, fishing some streams. And it clearly became quite popular as well, didn't it? Because they went further afield, and I particularly enjoyed the one in Idaho. They did one in Scotland. They did one in Bhutan as well, which is a dream destination. So it sort of moved out a little bit further from there. And I guess that showed it was deeply successful, wasn't it?
Yeah, it did, and those international shows were fantastic. In fact, I've got a love of Bhutan as well. Apparently, that's the only carbon positive country in the world, I think, where the carbon footprint is less than what it produces. So something like that. So I love the lifestyle, and I would not know about these countries if it wasn't for series like that. So it was super influential and beautiful. And I would, like you said, anybody, A River Somewhere, if you can get a hold of it, have a look at it, and it showcases Australian fishing really, really beautifully. So even though it is 25 years old now, I think, but beautiful show.
Yeah, it's timeless, I think, and carries across beautifully. It reminds me of Charles Rangeley Wilson's program over here, actually, The Accidental Angler, I think it was called, which was similar. And funnily enough, he went to Bhutan as well. But that was, to me, about what it meant. And there's a beautiful part on there where he catches a trout within the motorway that orbits London and gets quite emotional. And I think that says what it means to a lot of us as well, which I like very much. But you mentioned the piece that you wrote for us, and by the time this comes out, the magazine should be with people. It's a wonderful piece called Some Days Are Diamonds. And it talks about the fishing that we've just talked about, but it feels as though you really poured your soul into that article as well. It's beautifully crafted, beautifully written, wonderful photographs as well. And I was absolutely thrilled when you contacted me to say you had something. I'm really pleased to be able to have it in this edition of Fly Culture.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, and I absolutely love writing and putting those pieces together. And that one was fairly heartfelt. And it was quite easy to write. It was about. I won't spoil it for the people who are going to read the magazine, but it comes after a fairly significant life change for me. And I had a buddy who hauled me out to do some fly fishing, and it was one of those trips where all of the stars align. I'm notoriously clumsy on trout rivers or when I'm fishing. If there's one twig, I'll catch it on my back cast, or I'll slip on a rock, or there's always something like that. But this is, or it'll be rained out or whatever. But this is one of those times where, we really needed everything to go right, and it did. And it was just a beautiful few days that I spent with a really close buddy, who helped me through some difficult times, and that sort of encapsulates what fly fishing means to me and a lot of us. It resets your mind, and it just helps you through some tough periods. And it's just a beautiful way to spend time. It's medication is what it is. It's just a wonderful pastime. Even when things don't go perfectly, there's never been a time that, even during the absolute train wrecks, where you can't look back and at least have a laugh or enjoy that moment in hindsight or anything like that. So that piece was an important piece to me, and I really enjoyed writing it, and I'm super privileged to have it published in your magazine, especially on its 5th anniversary. So thanks once again for that.
You're welcome. I'm interested from a creative standpoint as well, because you said you were going through a significant life event, and yet the article you said flowed really well. And I often speak to writers, artists about the mood set when you're writing. And it seems to me that often when you're not firing on all cylinders, that the creative process seems to be a little easier to come by. Have you clearly found it with this? Do you find that generally though?
I've sort of discovered about myself that I've got two writing styles. There's one where I'll have a great fishing journey or odyssey to write about, and I'll sit on it for weeks or months, and it usually has 6 or 7 different versions, or I'll scrub paragraphs out, or I think of something else. Typically, the beauty of writing is when I start writing, the final edit is very different to what I sort of thought that I would write, because it kind of takes on a life of its own. So there's pieces that are really well crafted and take a long time, and I'll sleep on it, and I might sleep on it. Does that sentence sound right? I'll sleep on it. I'll come back to it in the morning, and they can take a long time. And then there's pieces that sort of come straight from the heart. And I've had a couple of those published, and this is an example of one of those where it sort of just pours out of me. It just flows out. It's very quick. Having said that, it will still take a few days, but not weeks or months. And it's sort of, hard on the sleeve kind of writing. And my very first article I got published in the Drake years ago was like that. I was having a bit of a tough time at home, and it was one night. I just everybody had gone to bed, and I went out the back, my back patio here, and I just got on the laptop and I just blurted out 800 words, and I just pressed send to Tom at the Drake, and never thought about it again. He'd rejected a hell of a lot of other articles I sent, and I thought, well, this is just another one. I've sent it to an editor. I'll just forget about it. Well, he picked it up and published it, and it was just, I think, because it was so genuine. And hopefully that comes through in this piece as well, because this is one of those pieces, and it just had some great context to it with the fishing trip itself, which was just, one of those things to remember for your life. So yeah, I hope readers get a bit of enjoyment.
Fantastic. And I love what you say about that process, how that process suddenly, when you are on that downswing, that able to write from the heart very, very quickly, rather than it flows, doesn't it? And I know exactly what you mean about that. The words can come out very, very quickly and very, very easily. And in fact, I don't know if you find that you're just sort of writing and you can't get it out quick enough, that it's there and it's a release, isn't it, in some respects, to be able to get that out. And it's probably some form of therapy as well, isn't it, to be able to do that?
Yeah, look, I don't think you could have said that any better. It is therapy. And I find at times, we all have stress in our lives every day. And I find that writing process, it's almost like purging your body of that stress and putting it onto paper or onto the laptop or what it might be. And I know some people who paint and do other artistic endeavors that feel the same way. They get out, stress, or it might even be the opposite. It might be this, exuberance or this happiness. But either way, there's this emotion that goes onto this creative medium, whatever it might be. And it is absolutely therapeutic. It really helps to deal with whatever it is you're dealing with. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, nice. And you talked about writing. I'm honoured to be included in the same sentence as the Drake, but you've been writing for a very long time. And your first piece, you were telling me, was published when you were 16. That must have been thrilling. Tell us a little bit about it and where it appeared.
Yeah, that was just a bolt from the blue, that one. I was actually in high school and I was doing a lot of fishing. I think I lived in a very small town, and I would fish anywhere that I could. And as soon as I got my motorcycle license, I could actually get my motorbike license and ride solo before I could get a car license and drive solo. So I got the motorbike license, and then that just opened up a whole new world for me. And I'd have my little 5-weight rod at the time. I'd have it, with elastic strapped to the side of the motorbike, and off I'd go. And, that opened up my range. And there were all these little creeks and dams and, little farmers' water holes and things like that around the district. And I would fish anywhere. And a lot of the places you'd get carp or you get wild goldfish, or a popular species is perch. We call them redfin out here, but it's the same as your perch out there. And then there's a few creeks that had brown trout in them. And I remember the first time I caught a brown trout. It wasn't on fly, but it was one of the best brown trout I've ever caught for my first trout. And it was, I didn't weigh it, but it would have been sort of 3.5 pounds, it would have been longer than 20 inches. And it was just, I thought I'd won the lottery. And I'd been fishing for quite a while locally. So I wrote down, I had an old typewriter at the time, and I just wrote this story for a local fishing magazine, a statewide fishing magazine called South Australian Angler. I believe it's still in operation. And I think, I look back on it and it's probably very amateurish, but I think the editor sort of snapped it up because South Australia is the driest state in what's known as the driest continent. So any freshwater fishing content was sort of pretty unusual. So they snapped it up. And the first I knew about it was this check that came in the mail. I think it was $100. And I was just over the moon. I got on my motorbike. I rode as fast as I could, half an hour to the next town, to the newsstand, grabbed one of those copies, and I sat on the curb, I sat on the footpath and read it, and I was just over the moon. And the funny part about that is I think I submitted that as an English project in high school as well, because due to the encouragement of my English teacher. And my English teacher was a real slob of a man. He just hated his job. He was just getting through the days, and that was the first time I ever saw him smile or sense a bit of pride in him when I showed him that article. So that was really meaningful for that. But that first article, I was super lucky that it got published, and from that point on, I always knew I could write. So I always told myself that, I can write, I can do this. And after that, I didn't write for quite a long time. But when I did get back to it, I just knew that, I've already been published. I can do this again, right? And the reason I didn't write for quite a long time is that first article was very much a how to, where to sort of piece. And I wrote about what I knew, but I wanted to get some experience up and get some more fishing years under me. You know, if I'm going to write a piece about how to fish for trout, I want to know that I'm giving the people who read it the right advice. And there were a lot of people out there who were much more experienced than me at the time. And at that time, I wasn't aware that there were any literary fly fishing magazines around, like Fly Culture, like the Drake, like the Fly Fish Journal, and they weren't around then. So I thought if you had to get published, you had to write about how to catch trout or how to catch Murray cod or how to catch trevally or whatever it might be. And I didn't feel confident enough to do that. And then I moved to Canada, and that opened up a whole new world for many reasons. But I discovered the Fly Fish Journal. I discovered the Drake. I discovered John Gierak's writing, and I thought, holy smokes, these people are doing this. This is the sort of stuff I want to write. So consequently, I got back into writing then, and I sort of haven't stopped since. I thoroughly enjoy it, and you know, those beautiful, you know, and I love reading those articles as much as writing them. You know, other people's articles, because everybody's got who gets published in those magazines, including Fly Culture, of course. Everybody's got their own spin and their own way of telling a story, and it's all beautiful. And it might be ways I hadn't thought of writing things, and the emotion and the just that, you know, you can be sitting there on the bankside with those people, whether they're fishing for Atlantic salmon or sea bass or whatever it is, and it really paints this picture that's just takes you to another world. And I think that's the beauty of it all, and that's why I love doing it and why I love reading it. You know, it's just such a beautiful process.
Yeah. And it's fascinating, your influences, because mine are pretty much identical. And I remember being lucky enough to fish in Montana and buying a copy of the Drake. And I thought, wow, this I can relate to this in a completely different way. And that's how the online magazine I produced for 6-7 years, Eat, Sleep, Fish, came about. Mm-hmm. Because I wasn't brave enough to look at print at that time, wanted to learn my trade, wanted to learn about how everything functioned. But it became clear that people felt like you and I and many of the listeners did about fishing. And it wasn't about how to tie a knot or how to tie a fly, which is important, don't get me wrong. But I want to hear about people who feel like I do about it. And, you know, it's been a great influence. And you mentioned Fly Life as well, which I think it's Rob Sloan, isn't it? Which I used to subscribe to that as well, which I think was a great magazine or is a great magazine too.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a great magazine. It's sort of evolved a bit over the years, but it's still going strong. And it's become a little bit more literary. That was very much a sort of a how-to magazine, but it's kind of rolled with the times. And they do a lot of instructional stuff that's sort of told in a storytelling kind of way. So it's kind of the best of both worlds as well. And that's beautifully produced. And I've been a subscriber of theirs for a long time as well. They have some wonderful articles as well. But it's great to see the direction that magazines are going, I think, and media in general, because the niche for all the how-to stuff has sort of become online and YouTube. And all the literary stuff, you know, there's been that resurgence in print, and it's just done so beautifully, you know. I love where we're at the moment in regard to all of that, and there must be a lot of people who feel the same way as you and I, Pete, because the quality of content out there from, you know, a huge amount of writers, it's just astounding, isn't it? There must be so many great writers out there and great editors, of course, but it's all just great stuff to read. I can't get enough of it.
Yeah, and we try, and I'm sure many others do, to encourage as many people as possible to have a go at this process. And it's not as daunting as you think. And if you can write from the heart rather than trying to write an article, that to me is of much more interest, and I think probably to readers as well. But you mentioned British Columbia there. What took you to British Columbia, and what was it like from a fishing standpoint comparable to what you're experiencing in Australia?
Yeah, good question. I lived in South Australia for 30 years and knew that I wanted a bit of a life change from where I grew up, and I thought I'd take a working holiday to British Columbia. Originally, it was going to be for 6 months, and then I ended up staying 5.5 years, I think. So, as happens, but I really loved the idea of a working holiday, and I'd been working at my job in South Australia for long enough that we get what's called long service leave. I don't know if you guys have that, but basically, you get for 10 years of service, you get a decent payout, like 13 weeks pay or something like that, and that was enough to buy me tickets and get me started in British Columbia. But that's where fly fishing really took off for me. Even though I'd been fly fishing since about the age of 15, I'd sort of always taken my spin gear, always taken my bait gear with me because I was just not sure about if fly fishing actually worked. And that's true. Back when I got into fly fishing, the internet was still not really a thing. So I had all these fishing books, and it showed these beautiful casts being done with these fly lines, but I never saw a fish get hooked. And I thought it was a bloody conspiracy theory. I really didn't. I just thought, like, this is just a scam so people buy more equipment, but I'll give it a go anyway. And I didn't actually believe for a long time that a fish could be caught on a fly. And then, and it took me a couple of years before it happened. And then that was an epiphany. Like, I just thought, wow, this really works. So I really got into fly fishing from then. But when I went to British Columbia, you've got to take your whole world in like 2 suitcases. So I had one suitcase, which was clothes, important documents, that sort of stuff. And the other suitcase was fly vest, flies, rods. So I had my priorities right. But it was all fly fishing gear. So I kind of, baptism by fire, I guess, over there. I was either going to catch fish on the fly or I wasn't going to catch fish. It wasn't entirely true because I met up with some people who did have some drift gear and stuff like that, which I tried out over there. But I pretty much stuck to fly fishing. And I didn't have an 8-weight rod at the time. I took my 5-weight, but I borrowed my cousin's 8-weight rod, and I bought the cheapest, nastiest, imported alloy reel for this 8-weight that I could. And I went out fishing for chum salmon. And have you ever fished for chum salmon, Pete?
I haven't, no.
Do yourself a favour and do it. Like they don't get talked about much, but they're the second largest Pacific salmon species, and they're absolute, like they're just astounding sport fish. I love them. They're my favourites. So I went, and they're quite easy to catch, because they come in big numbers, and they're very aggressive. Well, I hooked one of these chum salmon that was running upstream, and within about 30 seconds, the reel just exploded, and there were metal shards, and it was and I ended up breaking the rod that I'd borrowed off my cousin, so I had to replace that. But it was a real lesson that, oh wow, these fish are serious. These are not 10-inch brown trout. These are 20-pound absolute muscle. So I kind of learnt my lesson there and got some better gear. But that really started my fascination for anadromous fish, and I always loved fishing for chum salmon. We had a pink salmon run they're a smaller salmon, so they come every 2 years. The chum would come every year, and there's also sockeye and chinook, which I never caught yet, and coho, which are another great sport fish. So, and they're all these fish they all have slightly different lifestyles, all the Pacific salmon, and that's all very fascinating. And then, of course, there were coastal cutthroat trout. There were a few brook trout up on a couple of little mountains just outside of Vancouver, and what was I going to say? Smallmouth bass, which I never caught until I went out to Ontario later. But the Pacific salmon there on the west coast of North America, and particularly British Columbia, and steelhead, of course, astonishing fishery. Like it's like God's own country of fly. I couldn't be happier there. Absolutely incredible.
That sounds absolutely amazing. Moving to Canada then was a thrilling experience. The fishing was amazing. You smoked to reel, which is phenomenal. How would you compare, because I've talked about the cultures of fishing, and I know British Columbia a little bit. How would you compare that fishing culture to that you experienced at home in Australia? Is it completely different? Is it similar? Is it hardcore? Is it slightly less hardcore? How would you mark it against what you were used to in Australia?
I think what I'm used to in Australia, or was used to in Australia, was a fairly sedate type of fishing. As I said, the mountain streams, fairly quiet, not huge populations of people. I think the culture out in British Columbia is the fly fishing culture is much bigger, or a lot more dense. But I'm sort of comparing apples and oranges too. So, Vancouver's a city of 2 or 3 million people, so you're going to have a lot more. The percentage of fly fish is going to be greater there, and they've got the rivers and the resources to sort of warrant that. But there was, this great community of fly fishers out there, and lots of fly stores, which we don't have a lot of here. So you could always go in and you could chat to the people. And I've never fished in Montana, but I understand Montana's like that. Lots of fly stores, lots of culture with that. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And you could always chat to someone on the river, or going to the river, or in the fly fishing store about techniques, or what's running right now, or what the weather's doing, or the river's doing. So you're a lot more tuned in. And out here, even though social media has made it a bit more approachable for people and for people to connect, it's more doing your own scouting out here, whereas it's more community driven over there, I would say. Yeah, I think that would sum it up.
Do you think as well it's partly because of the species that many of the people are chasing there? So in some circles, some might think it's a higher net value fish in the sense of a salmon that you can possibly take home and eat, or obviously, of course, the mythical steelhead. And I know in my limited experience that we were catching a few fish, and word got out on the jungle drum somewhere or other, and the other bank was stacked with anglers the other side, which was cool, don't get me wrong. But do you think that has something to do with the mix as well?
Yeah, I think so. There is a lot of there's a lot of secrecy around steelhead rivers and stuff. If somebody's found steelhead in a river that's not real known, there's sort of a bit of a hush sort of tap on the nose kind of thing about it. And there is very much a grapevine over there. And I think even though the salmon and steelhead are suffering terribly from population losses for a bunch of different reasons, they still are in sufficient enough numbers in many areas that it does create this sort of almost gold rush mentality of all these fish when they start coming into the rivers. So you do get this, we call it combat fishing over there, because everybody's stacked up, which can cause its own problems. But generally, everyone's pretty respectful about that. But when it's on, and it doesn't take much for the grapevine to let that know. Whereas here, and there's a couple of podcasts I listen to in Australia, if the fishing's good, they won't report about it until a month after the fact, so that they're not giving anything away. So it's there's a little bit more secrecy surrounding it here, I think.
Yeah. So you came back to Australia after 5 memorable years in British Columbia. Did you come back a different person? Did you come back a different angler?
Yeah, I did. British Columbia really opened up my eyes in many respects. I got involved with an ecological society out there which ran a salmon hatchery, and there's a lot of pros and cons to salmon hatcheries. I know there's a lot of cons at the moment, but what I learned through that is this whole ecological process of salmon up close, and I was absolutely fascinated with every aspect of that. And we did habitat reconstruction, and we'd get the creek ready for the salmon to come back, if it got moved around, and we'd get the spawning gravel and stuff like that ready, and learned about the riparian vegetation, the insects in the rivers. So I learned a lot about the ecology of rivers, and the the Pacific salmon while I was there. And when I came back to Australia, and coming back to Australia was sort of only meant to be temporary. We were coming back to spend time with family and friends and possibly head back to Canada, but we ended up staying out here. I was so fascinated with it that an ecology degree came up at the university, which is like 3 blocks from my house. And we just had a baby, and I was working sort of full time at the time. So there's no better time to go back to full time school, bite off more than I could chew. But I did, and I loved. For the most part, I really loved that ecology degree, and it just, it made me learn more about how everything is connected. Us humans with the fish, with animals, with the plants, the geology, everything's connected. We're one big global community of everything. And I think as fly fishers, we kind of know that. We don't go to rivers blindfolded and throw a hook in expecting to catch a fish. We see what the river's doing. We see what are there birds on the river? Are there insects flying around? What's the weather doing? All that sort of stuff. So I think we're all sort of ecologists anyway. But it was really good to have all this training in ecology, sort of from an official standpoint, backed up by scientific evidence as well. So I thoroughly enjoyed the process of university, and I've got my time in Canada to thank for that. So to answer your question, I did come back a different person. I was a much better fly angler than before I left, and I was much more involved in the whole process of rivers and the environment and what affects fish populations, and that's been a real obsession of mine too.
And that segues beautifully into your new project, the Torrent Global. Can you tell me and listeners a little about it and how it came about and what inspired you to do it?
Yeah. So I've got this is quite recent, but I after my university degree, I've been trying to get work in ecological fields, whatever that may look like, and that's a bit slow at the moment. But I didn't want my university knowledge, I suppose, to go to waste. So I've always been thinking about how I can put that knowledge to use, and sort of, I'm a real procrastinator. So usually I think about things and then think myself out of things before I start anything, and I'm aware of that. But this came quite quickly, and I just thought, well, geez, why don't I make a website and put some fly fishing content on there, and put some, just a bit of ecological nudgings in there as well, because it's all tied in together, and that's what I love. I love fly fishing. I love how it ties in with the environment, and I wanted to share that sort of knowledge. But so I created this website. I called it the Torrent. I don't know where that came from. It just came out of my head, and I ran with it. But it kind of makes sense. Torrent isn't, you can think of it as an undammed river or a torrent of information. So I started this little website, and it's a bit amateurish because I'm kind of faking it till I make it, learning as I go. I don't know much about web design, but the idea of it is to have, there's a lot of websites out there, really, really good websites out there. A couple that come to mind are Tom Rosenbauer's, the Orvis fly fishing site there, and what are those guys out in eastern states, Trout Bitten, and they've got over 1,000 articles on the huge resource. But this is what I'm trying to do, is more small snippets of things. So I'm trying to pinch stuff off the net of environmental things. It might be dams coming down in the States. It might be the state of Atlantic salmon in the UK. It might be something in Australia. It might be Didymo in New Zealand. And I'm just providing 2 or 3 sentences with a couple of links to go to the astounding work that's already out there. And the idea of it was to just, I think ignorance is bliss. If we don't know that our rivers are in trouble, we don't act on it, or we don't care. So we think everything's rosy. But if we realize that every river has a story, I mean, you can't Google one river and find that it hasn't had issues with mining or logging or, domestic fish or spills or whatever. So every river has a story, and they all need our help. And the idea of the torrent is just to provide something that somebody can look at on their lunch break maybe, and just have a 2-minute read and go, well, that doesn't concern me, or I'll click on that link and that'll take you to a more involved page that tells you everything. So that's what I'm doing at this stage. And then the other thing, I guess the impetus for that, I was thinking about an article that a few years ago I submitted to the Drake and it got published. Excuse me. And it's of a river that's really dear to my heart, which is the Skagit River. And when most people think of the Skagit, they think of the river in Washington that developed this new form of double-handed casting, and that the salmon and steelhead runs there. And it is the same river, but it's very different in the fact that the Skagit River starts in Canada, and it flows through as a natural freestone stream till it gets to the US border, and then the US manage their river very differently. They dam it. So there's 3 dams on the US side, and then that, of course, has its own issues. But I wrote a pretty more of a journalistic piece about the history of the Skagit River from the Canadian perspective, and some of the threats that it faced and still does face, which are many and varied. But of course, what happens in Canada affects what happens in the States because it flows through into there. So this article got published, and in the next issue of the Drake, a letter to the editor, someone wrote in and said, how is it that I can find more about the news on my local river from the Drake than I can from the local papers? And I thought that was really, that sort of struck me. And it's one of these things, like this bloke had obviously fished the Skagit, knew the Skagit well, but didn't know of what was going on with it. So I really am trying to just not sensationalize or anything, but just point out that, hey, there might be an issue with your river, or there might be something that, maybe you could sign a petition or talk to your local politician or just something, I don't want to be preachy, but just let people know and let it circulate in their head and see how they deal with it. Because if they don't know, then they don't know, and they won't act. And I think the rivers need all the help we can give them. And I think if we know that, then we're sort of obliged to help if we want to use the resource. And the other side of the web page is I've promoted a little kids page as well, because I love kids, and I'm really excited when they get into fly fishing. So I want to sort of highlight a junior of the month, sort of, so to speak. If there's somebody out there who's fly tying, a kid who's fly tying, or he's fishing, or he's, maybe highlight them, give them a bit of a shout out, and get them interested in thinking about how their river or their ocean or their estuary works, with regard to the insects and the fish. And it's not just an endless resource. So, I think, and 'cause they're going to be our advocates of the future who keep this thing going. So that's kind of the impetus. It's a bit like my writing. It'll probably go in a direction I have no idea about at this stage. It might be a complete flop. I don't know. But it's just, it's something that I feel good doing. And it's, keeps me off the streets, I guess. But yeah, it's a bit of fun, that's for sure.
Your timing's really good, because it strikes me that anglers are more engaged about these issues more than ever. And to have somewhere, a resource that actually you can see what's happening in our global village, as it were, and you're able to see what is happening, the good stuff, and not the not so good stuff as well. So I applaud that. I think your timing is really good, and I would encourage people to go have a look and perhaps try and support it, and then perhaps contact Ben. Again, as I always say on here, I approached Ben to come on the podcast. He's not asked me that he's got this. I just wanted to talk to him about fishing, and then learnt a little bit more about the torrent. But perhaps if we can support these things a little bit more, that we're all engaged and we can learn about what's happening on a global basis because we're all affected by these issues. Some of them may be slightly different. They may be dams, they may be farming, they may be sewage issues. If we're aware of all of these things, then we can all add our voices globally, I think, to petitions or whatever. I'm still not 100% sure how petitions will work, but at least if petitions are getting greater numbers, people will have a look at them. And that would be something that would be pleasing. So could you tell us, Ben, how we can find more about the torrent, the website, social media and stuff like that?
Yeah, and thank you, Pete. And my little website, it doesn't make any money or anything like that. It's just a little project. But I really encourage people to tell me, anywhere in the world, and that's the beauty of the internet. If you've got an issue or something you want me to highlight, then I can put it up for them. So I want the people to sort of drive where this thing goes. But it's the website is thetorrent.com.au. Don't forget the .au. Based here in Australia, but as I said, I'll put any content from anywhere in the world up there. And on Instagram, it's the Torrent Fly Fishing, at the Torrent Fly Fishing. So join up. I'll put photos up, and I would love to hear comments and get people involved. And if there's any kids out there that want to, I'll send them a sticker if they show me their fly tying skills or fly fishing skills, and I'd love to highlight them as well. So check it out, and would love to hear from anybody.
That's great. Thanks, Ben, for that. Tell me about yourself. How would you describe yourself as an angler?
Very poorly. No. Look, opportunistic, I guess. Look, I'll fish for pretty much anything. As I said, I really love anything with an adipose fin. But I'll fish for anything. I prefer freshwater. Even though I live on a beach, I just prefer freshwater. I do like the salt as well, but if I had to pick, I'd pick my freshwater. But I'll fish when I can, and when I can't fish, I'm always fishing, in inverted commas, by gaining information either on the net, reading a book, watching a video, listening to podcasts. So I'm always in that fly fishing community somehow. But as a fisherman, I would consider myself average. I'm a decent caster, not brilliant. I'm confident enough to go out and catch fish, and I always enjoy it, which is the main thing, right? So definitely not a competition fisherman or anything like that, but I do get out and I do enjoy it. And I'm pretty clumsy, so I usually have a story to tell because I always end up in the river or something crazy happens. So but always have fun, which is the main thing.
That's wise words. I often ask people about fishing train wrecks, but I think by the sound of what you've said, that could be a whole podcast in itself. So we may
probably
we may come back to that at a later stage. Where's your dream destination? Where is it because often your part of the world and the country next door as well often come up as a dream destination. So I'm fascinated to hear how it would be from you being the other side of things. Where is the place that you would most love to go fish and cast a fly?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I am super thankful for the fishing we have here and in New Zealand, obviously, which is, just a short plane ride away from here. And again, that's another podcast. God, New Zealand is God's own country. But look, I think I love my small streams and my trout. I'd really love to. It'll be a toss-up, I think. I've always wanted to fish for West Slope cutthroat trout in the Elk River drainage of British Columbia, something I haven't done. I've been through there but haven't fished, and I'd really love to get back and do that. Or somewhere on the eastern seaboard of the US or Canada, so Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador, Maine, and fish for some little blue line brook trout over there, native brook trout. I don't care if they're 10 inches or 8 inches. I'm not necessarily after big fish, but that's what really lights my fire. So if that might change. I've got 100 bucket list destinations, but as we all do. But I would probably lean towards one of those two. Yeah.
Nice choices as well. And do you find your bucket list, the order of it, changes from time to time as well? So number one might be replaced by someone else coming out of number 30 or something. Do you find that shifts around a fair bit?
Absolutely. Very dynamic, always shuffling around, like a pack of cards. Yeah. You ask me tomorrow and I want to go bone fishing in Venezuela, but it certainly does. It certainly does. And it's really hard. I mean, I've listened to people on your podcast, Pete, answer that question, and they sort of straining to pick one destination, and I'm the same. It's hard to pick just one, but there's so many out there.
So many rivers, so little time.
Yeah, true.
Right. Well, I'm going to start wrapping up because we've spoken over an hour now, and it's been wonderful to catch up with you and to talk with you. I think it's a wonderful, lovely, interesting podcast that I'm sure listeners are going to enjoy. I would encourage them to, again, have a look at the torrent and what Ben is looking to do. Give him a follow. I think it would be really cool to do that and help our friends in the fishing community who are trying to do good stuff and highlight what's going on out there. So I'd greatly appreciate if you're able to do that. It's been lovely to speak with you, Ben. I'm really excited about your latest piece, Some Days Are Diamonds, and I'm sure our listeners are going to really enjoy reading about that. And I'd like to say a massive thank you for you taking the time to speak with me on the Fly Culture podcast today.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much, Pete. It really is an honour. I love what you do with this. And once again, congratulations on the 5th anniversary of that magnificent magazine. It's a real privilege to be published in there. So thank you.
You're most welcome. Thank you for the kind words as well. Well, everyone, this has been another episode of the Fly Culture podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as me. And it's lovely that we can talk to people the other side of the world and discover that they feel exactly as we do about fly fishing. So as ever, there'll be no charge for these. Thank you so much for listening to the Fly Culture podcast.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.